Hello, and welcome to Military History Inside Out, brought to you by WarScholar. We talk about military history from ancient times to modern and everything in between. I'm Chris Alvarez, and thank you for listening. I'm speaking with Howard Blum, author of Night of the Assassins, the untold story of Hitler's plot to kill FDR, Churchill, and Stalin, published by HarperCollins, June 2nd, 2020. Thank you for speaking with me.
My pleasure.
So first, how did you get into studying and writing on this subject?
I came across a press conference that FDR gave in the Oval Office when he returned from the Tehran conference. I was in the FDR Presidential Library researching something else, actually. And I was going through his press conferences, and they're all recorded, and one can hear them. And in this press conference, he's talking about what happened at Tehran in November 1943. The meeting had been top secret, and he's now telling the American press for the first time what went on. And about 20 minutes into this long press conference, he says, by the way, we had a security problem. In the middle of the conference, I had to move from the American embassy to the Russian embassy for security concerns. There were a group of Nazi commandos on the loose in Tehran. And then he gives a hearty laugh and says, quote, it would have been a pretty good haul if they had gotten all three of us, meaning himself, Churchill, and Stalin. And the press joins in laughing. And then what's most amazing to me, the conversation just moves on. They start talking about China, the China question. There are no follow-up questions from the complacent wartime press. So I began to see, what is this all about? And there were a couple of books written after the war that had interviews with some participants in this, but mostly with pseudonyms. And then I found references in memoirs by Churchill, by Churchill's bodyguard, by FDR's bodyguard, Mike Reilly. And then finally, I came across in 2003, the SVR, that's the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, what the KGB was called after the KGB went out of style. They released a treasure trove of previously classified documents about what really happened at Tehran. And I took these documents, had them translated, and then went to British archives, American archives, and German archives, and I was able to put the pieces together in this gigantic puzzle and relate with some accuracy and drama and hopefully some suspense what really occurred during those 6 days in Tehran in 1943.
Mm-hmm. So how do you, I assume the book is chronological, how do you divide up how you talk about the subject, and what do you focus on? I don't know how much information you had to draw on, but
there was a great deal of information to draw on, and what it really is, the whole book becomes really a cat and mouse game between the two sides. On one side, there's Mike Reilly. He's the head of FDR's Secret Service detail. 2 days after Pearl Harbor, Mike is given the job to be head of the detail. He's just 31 years old, and he's sort of overwhelmed. He describes himself in a self-deprecating way as an Irish cop with more brawn than brains. And he now has to protect a wartime commander-in-chief. But there's never been a war like this before in U.S. history. For the first time, enemy planes can fly over the White House. Paratroopers can drop from the sky on the White House lawn. And there's something else. This president presents a unique difficulty in protecting him. He is paralyzed. He's literally a sitting target. And Mike realizes he has to put himself between the crosshairs of an assassin's bullet if it comes to that. And on the other side, the German spy masters who are coming up with this plan, this is really a desperation strategy for the Germans. By the winter of 1943, they realize the war is lost on the battlefield. They realize after the German defeat at Stalingrad, after the successful Allied invasion of North Africa after America has gotten into the war and the bombers are coming off the assembly lines in the United States. They're just not going to win. But they have this idea of a pragmatic endgame strategy. They will hopefully get a stalemate out of the jaws of defeat. They'll keep on fighting, and the U.S. will have a negotiated peace.
Mm-hmm.
However, in January 1943, at the final day of the Casablanca Conference in North Africa, FDR makes a surprising announcement. I say surprising because it takes Churchill by total surprise. FDR says we are going to fight on until the unconditional surrender of the German, Italian, and Japanese forces.
Mm-hmm.
And with these two harsh words, unconditional surrender, the Nazis know that this war is not going to have a negotiated ending, that they will one day have to stand before an Allied war crime tribunal and answer for their crimes against humanity, against civilians, against the Jews. That also remember the last time in history the ultimatum of an unconditional surrender was given was Rome to Carthage, and Carthage was completely destroyed, and they believe that will be their fate too,
mm-hmm.
unless something can be done. So these two spy masters, the head of the SS Section 6, General Walter Schellenberg, and Admiral William Carnassus, the head of the Abwehr, begin to plot to see if there's a way to get an impossible mission to suddenly become possible, a way of targeting the big three. And Mike Reilly has to deal with this. And so it goes back and forth between these two sides. That's how the book is structured, largely.
So at this time, Iran was pretty much run by the British, I believe.
Well, it was the British and the Russians. In 1941, both the British and the Russians invaded Iran.
Mm-hmm.
And they sort of divided the country. And the Russians had largely control of the north and parts of Tehran, and the British were elsewhere in the country. And the Americans were slowly coming in for a Lend-Lease presence to send supplies over the railways to Russia.
Mm-hmm. Why did they hold this meeting in Iran? Did it seem pretty safe, and how were the Germans able to move around in there?
Well, it's a very good question why they picked Tehran. It was sort of the last choice that the Allies came to. What happened was FDR very much wanted to have this meeting for the first time between the big three. He wanted it for two reasons. One, to plan D-Day, and there was some arguments about when D-Day should be scheduled and where the invasion of Europe should take place, whether through the soft underbelly of Europe, as Churchill referred to it, Italy and France, or directly across the Channel. And also FDR had this vision after the war of a sort of United Nations, and he wanted to bring that up between the three Allied leaders. He first proposed that they meet in Fairbanks, Alaska. And Stalin just didn't want to do that. He then suggests a ship at sea in the Atlantic, hopefully off North Africa. Stalin again rejects this. Finally, Churchill comes up with this quixotic idea of let's meet in 3 tents in the desert in the Middle East. And Stalin doesn't even deign to answer that. It's too absurd. So FDR, in desperation, sends Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, to Moscow to see if he can get Stalin to agree to a meeting and where. Out of this, Stalin comes up with Tehran, and FDR and Churchill accept it. What is so ironic, it was the worst possible place for a meeting for several reasons.
Mm-hmm.
First, since the beginning of the war, the Nazis had been running a spy operation in the city of Tehran. It's a city of 1 million people, and they had assets in place. They had safe houses. They had a communication system with Berlin. And also, for the past 3 months before the conference itself, they had aerial insertion missions. They had a base in the Crimea from conquered territory that the Germans had in Crimea, where they were sending paratroopers into Iran to sabotage Allied Lend-Lease war materials shipments that were going by train to Moscow. So they had this network for sending in commandos into the country. And the man in charge of these aerial insertions was a guy called Otto Skorzeny. He was a ruthless and yet inventive SS commando. He headed the SS's Special Action School, and at Orienburg, right outside Sachsenhausen concentration camp. And he was the one that Hitler had picked for this operation to kill the big three. Mm. And so everything seemed to fall into place for the Nazis. Suddenly this impossible mission began to seem perhaps possible, and they felt as if the operational gods had smiled on them.
I'm speaking with Howard Blum, author of Night of the Assassins. You can find more information about his work on howardblum.com. If you like this podcast so far, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. Please go to my website, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com for links to news, videos, new books, and my social media links. If you're interested in other kinds of history, you can find the links to my other podcasts and associated book lists at historyrabbithole.com. That's rabbit as in the animal. historyrabbithole.com. Thank you for your support. And now back to the podcast. I can imagine that even if the three wanted to keep their presence, their movements into Tehran secret, I imagine just the size of their entourages or the, what they brought would tip people off that something big was happening or going to happen.
Well, they actually did a fairly good job of keeping it secret. FDR, for example, snuck out of the United States. He was supposed to be on the presidential yacht for a week, sailing, getting a rest when he actually had taken the SS Iowa, a battleship, to North Africa. But the Germans found out about the meeting through a spy, and this spy is actually very interesting. He was a walk-in. A walk-in is someone who comes to you unannounced, bearing gifts. And because of this, a walk-in is the most reviled man in the espionage community. You don't know why he's doing this. Is he doing this for ego? Is it out of patriotism? Is it out of money? Or is he really, and this is what makes the people who he comes to the most suspicious, the most wary, is he really a double agent? Is he spreading disinformation? And what happened was a man comes into the German embassy in Ankara, Turkey. He says he's the valet for the British ambassador in Ankara, and says each night when the British ambassador goes to bed, he leaves his keys out on the nightstand, and that allows the valet to have access to his safe where he keeps the decoded cables and diplomatic traffic. Mm-hmm. And he's willing to give this diplomatic traffic to the Germans in exchange for 20,000 pounds, 20,000 British pounds, which is a fortune, worth about $1 million today. And the Germans hear this, and they're not quite sure what to do. But then the head of Section 6, the German SS Cloak and Dagger operation, says, okay, we'll pay him the money, but he has the SS forgers forged 20,000 pounds. And so they get the documents, and as soon as they look at the documents, Schellenberg later writes that they were absolutely breathtaking. The spy is so good, so successful, he keeps on making deliveries that the Germans give him the code name Cicero after the German orator, because these spies' documents spoke so eloquently. And these diplomatic cables reveal the time and place to the Germans of the Tehran conference. So they knew, and now they had this network in the city, and they could now send their teams in there, and they just needed to come up with a plan that would work, which they eventually get pretty close to actually achieving.
Did they start paying this guy real money instead of forged money?
They keep on paying him forged money after the war. And this sounds incredible. He sues the German government to try to collect the money because he takes it to the bank after the war and they won't accept it. And he has this lawsuit that goes on for about a year and a half, which he ultimately loses. He's trying to get restitution for his spying from the new German government.
Wow, I've never heard of something so outrageous and audacious.
Yes.
So do you go much in the book? Do you go much into this, the training and development of this SS secret action group, I think you said?
Yes. The men at Orienberg facility, this SS Commando Center, is run by Otto Skorzeny. And many of these men, the key people, had served with him on another important mission, which helped convince the Nazis that they could actually succeed. This was the rescue of Mussolini. Mussolini was imprisoned on the top of a 7,000-foot mountain in the Italian Alps after he was deposed by the Italian Parliament, the Supreme Council. And Hitler tells Skorzeny he wants Skorzeny to rescue Mussolini. So Skorzeny looks at this problem. There's only one cable car up to the top of the mountain, and the cable car is guarded by a battalion of Italian troops. There's no way they can storm that. You can't send paratroopers down out of the sky on the mountaintop because the winds are too strong at 7,000 feet. They'll be blown off the mountaintop. You can't land a plane. There's not enough room, and the top is very rocky. So he comes up with the idea of having gliders. And on September 12th, 1943, 12 gliders swoop down out of the sky and try to land on this mountaintop. 7 of them crash, but 5 of them do land on the mountaintop. Skorzeny and enough of his men scramble out. They storm the fortress where Mussolini is being kept captive, and they rescue him. 3 nights later, they bring Mussolini to Hitler's hideout in East Prussia. There's a ceremony. Skorzeny is given the Iron Cross. He's now promoted to major, and the Allied press even is talking about Skorzeny, his daring and his accomplishment. The New York Herald Tribune calls him the most dangerous man in Europe, and Hitler takes him aside and gives him this mission to now rescue or now assassinate the 3 Allied leaders at Operation Long Jump. So he's the one who's planning the tactics in Tehran. What they eventually discover, and they send a reconnaissance force to Tehran. When the U.S., Mike Reilly, does his reconnoitering of Tehran, both he and the Nazis are struck by the same discovery, which fills them both with a sort of fear. For Mike Reilly, Tehran is a hot zone. It's filled with raging typhoid. There's an invisible enemy stalking the city, very much like what we're going through these days. It seems that the gutters on the sides of the road are do not just contain fresh water. That's where the Iranians dump all their refuge. And so typhoid is raging. However, Reilly also finds out there are water tunnels that connect with 3 embassies, the American, British, and Russian embassies that were built by American engineers. And this brings in fresh water from the mountains to these embassy compounds. The Germans also find out about this, and their plan is to use these water tunnels to sneak into the British embassy compound and surprise the Big 3. And the night they've chosen is a night they know that the Big 3 will be celebrating together. There's a photograph in my book. It's the front piece of the book, and it's Churchill's 69th birthday party. And you can see FDR, Churchill, and Stalin sitting shoulder to shoulder. You can see the birthday cake in front of them. It's sliced up. It's on their plates. And you can almost hear their voices in your mind singing "Happy Birthday, Winston." And at that very moment, as that photograph is taken, these 6 assassins who are on the loose in the city are planning to get to the water tunnels to sneak in to the British embassy compound, burst into the dining room, and change history.
Sounds like a movie plot.
It would be an interesting movie, and there are some conversations now. We'll see if they come to fruition.
So I'm hesitant to ask any questions because I don't want to reveal any points in the story, that I want people to read and and learn for themselves through reading the book what happened.
We won't give away the ending, who wins the war, and whether or not they survive. Right? That's spoiler alert.
So it seems as though, so one question I have is, in the planning stages, the Germans, I guess they wanted to keep the group small so as not to tip off Allied security, but, it seems, who was doing most of the planning? Was it up to the level of Hitler, or did he just let subordinates take care of that?
Hitler let Schellenberg and Skorzeny do most of the planning. And what happened was, their insight was that they had two groups of commandos coming in 3 separate planes. The first group had 38 commandos. However, their arrival was betrayed by a double agent who was working for the SS, who was really a Russian agent, a Russian spy. And so the Russians were waiting when this first 38 men came down out of the sky, and most of them were killed before they even landed. The ones that survived were interrogated thoroughly. Mike Reilly writes about being told about this interrogation, and he said he was glad he didn't have to witness it. He could only imagine what the NKVD would do to these German assassins. Then he said, well, this was wartime. But then he next finds out that there were 6 commandos still on the loose. And again, for the 4 days of the conference, there's this cat and mouse game. And Mike Reilly now has to work with the Russians. They're searching a city of 1 million people, trying to find these 6 commandos. We're moving from safe house to safe house and trying to wait till the evening of Churchill's 69th birthday party when they can strike.
Okay. Now, are there any other, before I turn towards how you did your research, and you already mentioned a few things, are there any other little tidbits or issues you want to tantalize listeners with before we move to that?
Well, a couple of interesting things. One interesting story is FDR sneaks out of the United States, and he's on the USS Iowa, which is a larger, I think the largest battleship we have in the war. And he's going across the Atlantic. With him are the Joint Chiefs of Staff, members of his cabinet, and Harry Hopkins, his advisor. And they're out at sea on the 3rd day, and the captain, he wants to impress FDR, and he says, let's have a demonstration of our artillery prowess. And they put balloons in the air, and the Iowa big guns shoot them out of the sky. But one of the other boats in the flotilla, one of the other ships, a Navy destroyer, is going to use this exercise to get his men doing torpedo practice. And they sight on the Iowa and insert a dummy torpedo into the torpedo tubes, and they launch this dummy at the Iowa. And only after they fire it do they realize it's a real live torpedo. And it comes within 2 yards of the battleship where FDR and the Joint Chiefs of Staff are all on board. And it just misses them. And the whole operation, sort of ended right then and there. The Americans could have accomplished by mistake through friendly fire what the Germans were trying to do before the operation even got underway.
Wow.
Another incident that I found sort of interesting, in the books that were written after the war by a French journalist, a Hungarian journalist, they refer to a woman asset who was working with the Germans. The German spy master in place in the city, Hans Mercer, had an Iranian girlfriend, mistress, who helped them locate the water tunnels. and they never reveal her name. There are the interrogations of Mercer and this woman are in both the British and American archive, declassified archives, and her name is Lily Sanjari. What comes out the most interesting thing, Lily Sanjari, at the same time she was Mercer's mistress, was also having an affair with this American GI who played in a jazz band. He played a trumpet in a jazz band in Tehran. And this trumpet-playing jazzman was actually an American intelligence officer. That was his cover. I mean, you couldn't make this up. And she is also telling him information, too, that later becomes important to the Allies. It was tidbits like that doing the research and trying to put this story together that made it so rich for me, and I hopefully will engage the reader, too.
Wow. That's some stories of cloak and dagger there.
Yes.
All right, so let's turn back towards the documents that you found and used. What archives did you tap for this?
Well, the National Archives in Washington had, for example, this interrogation of Lily Sanjari. The German archives had a good deal about the commando operations, the aerial insertions from the base in Crimea. They gave the name of the sergeant who trained the commandos in parachute jumping, the names of the planes, how long the mission took, how problems some of them had with oxygen, and how they were taught to parachute into Tehran. So that all came together. And then the Churchill archives in Churchill College in Cambridge were interesting. Churchill writes about coming into Tehran. He had hoped to sneak into the city. He had hoped the meeting would remain secret. As soon as he gets off the plane on the morning of November 27th, he sees it's not much of a secret because there's a welcoming ceremony for him. And he sort of grumbles about this. And then they put him into this open-top car, and they drive into the city, and he realizes the entire route into the city is lined by Iranian cavalry in these sort of comic opera uniforms, and they're sitting high on their mounts, and he's saying it points the whole way like a beacon. Anyone wants to see where I'm going, any assassin will be easy to, he can get me in the crosshairs just by following the line of cavalry. He'll know which way I'm going. And then it gets even worse. He's stuck in traffic outside the British embassy, and he's 5 minutes, 7 minutes. It goes on for 12 minutes, and he's sitting in this open-top car, and he writes, and or you can read this in the archives, if it had been planned to put me in the worst, most possible harm, it couldn't have been better planned. They succeed in putting me in harm's way quite expertly, he says sarcastically. So those are the kind of gems one could find in the archive. I mean, the humanness of Churchill's fear. And he had reason to be fearful because the Germans had shot down a plane in Portugal that was flying off from the Portuguese airport when he was coming back from North Africa that they thought he was on. They saw two men, their spy at the airport, saw two men getting on the plane. One looked like Churchill with the Hamburg hat, the 7-inch cigar in the mouth, the dark suit, and behind them was a tall, thin bodyguard, Detective Walter Thompson. And so they sent their fighters from a base in France to shoot this plane over the Bay of Biscay, and they shoot it down, and it turns out that the two men on board were actually the actor, Leslie Howard, who looked like the bodyguard, and he was traveling with his accountant, who looked very much like Churchill. Wow. And Churchill writes about this too, and it says, there, but for the inscrutable workings of fate, I escaped and these two innocent men were killed.
I'm speaking with Howard Blum, author of Night of the Assassins. You can find more information about his work on howardblum.com. If you like this podcast so far, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. please go to my website, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com for links to news, videos, new books, and my social media links. If you're interested in other kinds of history, you can find the links to my other podcasts and associated book lists at historyrabbithole.com. That's rabbit as in the animal. historyrabbithole.com. Thank you for your support. And now back to the podcast. So speaking of which, do you have any information on how many assassination attempts were planned and perhaps attempted beforehand against each of these three individuals, apart from what you just...
There was that one aerial attempt.
Mm-hmm.
They also, the Germans sent a group, two renegade Russian turncoats, to try to put a bomb under Stalin's car. And this bomb was designed to look like a piece of mud, and it would affix to the bottom of the car. It was quite ingenious. But they parachute into Russia. They know where Stalin is in the field. And before they get to the camp, they're caught. The Germans had a plan for getting FDR, too. And this plan never really got off the ground. They were going to send agents, marksmen, by submarine into Long Island. They were then going to make their way to Washington, D.C., and hopefully pick off FDR through the White House grounds, but this never came to fruition. And it wasn't until everything seemed to fall in place that the city of Tehran was picked, that they had this network there, and they also had to get something done because with an unconditional surrender, they knew that they would have to appear before a war crimes tribunal. So now this was a desperation strategy, really.
As far as the Soviet or Russian records, are those... I know that after a lot of records were released, Russia kind of pulled back and reclassified stuff. Are the records that you used, are they still available, or did they get sort of shut down in a sense?
Well, those records are still available. Russia is very proud of what they did at the Tehran conference, how they worked to prevent this. They overplay their role. They don't give Mike Reilly enough credit. Interestingly enough, at the press conference, when these records were presented to the world, they brought out the head of their first chief directorate. And a reporter asked him, "Is this all there is? Do you have something else?" And he said, "In espionage, there always is one more file that you can never get." And similarly, I went to the CIA and I was having this discussion, and I said, I want to tell the true story of Operation Long Jump. And I was talking with an official who I've had some relationship with, and he starts to laugh, and he said, "Howard, in espionage stories, there is never always the entire true story. You can only get as close to what people are willing to reveal. There's always something hidden. And until the final file is revealed, I'd like to think this is as complete a story as we're going to get on Operation Long Jump."
What part of the research did you find most enjoyable?
What I liked the most is when I discovered how close the Nazis had come in succeeding. I had known that 38 men were captured. That was clear in the American records. Mike Reilly writes about this. But I hadn't realized that 6 were still on the loose, that they're on their way to making the water tunnels. And when I saw that, I sort of had a good third act for the book, and also something that was quite shocking, how close the Nazis came to succeeding and how close history came to being changed forever.
Mm-hmm. That might answer my next question, but perhaps there's another answer, which is what did you find that was most surprising in your research? Again, avoiding any reveals.
But again, surprising to me was the role of synchronicity. I mean, here you have this really impossible mission. We've got to kill the 3 Allied leaders, and we don't know where they're going to meet or when they're going to meet. We realize they're going to be well guarded. because they control the largest standing armies between them in the entire world, and we'll have to come up with a plan to sneak up on them. So bit by bit, everything falls into place. The Allies pick Tehran, which works perfectly for the Nazis. The Nazis then get a spy who tells them when and where the meeting is going to take place, and then the water tunnels lead right into the British Embassy compound where Churchill, FDR, and Stalin will be together to celebrate Churchill's 69th birthday. So that all these events can fall into place as if it's almost preordained that this operation, this impossible mission, really has a chance of succeeding. That, to me, was the most interesting and shocking aspect of my research.
Was Stalin's resistance to the other locations for security reasons or some other reason?
Why Stalin resisted is a matter of debate. He said that he didn't want to get too far from Moscow. He had to be commanding the Russian army. Other people have said, his detractors, he's just afraid of flying. He didn't want to fly very far. And, speaking of distances, FDR, who was paralyzed, had a weakened immune system, has to go across the world, 6,500 miles, through war zones. One has to admire his courage and his commitment to the future of the world, because he thinks it's going to be worked out at this conference, and his bravery can't be overstated.
So this question, again, I'm trying to ask questions without revealing anything or prompting you to reveal anything. The question is, what was the most difficult aspect to research? But perhaps I can ask, can you imagine any future information coming out that could round out some aspect of the story you're still wondering about?
Well, the biggest mystery would be Otto Skorzeny's, the commando who led the mission, trained the troops, his actual files. If I believe that they were destroyed after the war, he wanted to protect them from war crime tribunals. As it was, he did have to stand before a war crime tribunal for something he did in the Battle of the Bulge. He led commando troops in American uniforms behind the lines, and he was put on war crimes for impersonating American troops. He actually got off from that. He wasn't found guilty. And I believe that these files, if they haven't been destroyed, perhaps they're buried somewhere, and it'd be fascinating if they appear someday.
Was there anything that any of this that had an emotional impact on you, either positively or negatively?
Well, I was emotionally moved by Mike Reilly's, FDR's bodyguard, commitment to protecting FDR. At one point early on, during one of the campaigns, he's guarding FDR, and they take FDR by train to a campaign stop outside Philadelphia, and he's on the back of the rear car. They prop him up before the crowds come in, and Mike goes into the crowd to keep an eye on the people. And he's standing there far back in the crowd, and he sees a knife thrown at FDR. And FDR can't duck. He can't move out of the way. And the knife hits FDR in the chest. It turns out it's a rubber knife, and it just bounces off. But this vision is a nightmare that stays with Mike Reilly for the rest of his time as FDR's bodyguard, and all through the Tehran conference. And this vision of his commitment to saving the boss, as he calls FDR, a term of affection and respect, of saving his life, is deeply ingrained and something he lives with and keeps him up at night, literally.
Okay. Just a quick, again, you don't have to go into detail here, but was there much military protection in Tehran at the time? I guess it would have been provided by British and Soviet troops. And I guess there wouldn't be... You did mention an American band in that area.
Yes, Americans had troops outside the city, but the airport where FDR landed, where Churchill landed, was controlled by Russians. You land and they saw a red star. And Mike Reilly saw all these Russians patrolling the area with submachine guns, and he writes, well, the Russians are our allies, but an ally is not the same as a friend. And he was very wary of the Russians. When FDR chose to stay in the Russian embassy for security reasons, he would say there were men dusting all the furniture, and they'd bend over and you could see the revolvers strapped to their hips. They were really NKVD agents. And so there was a great deal of suspicion between the Americans and the Russians, and yet Reilly has to work with the Russians during the 4 days of the conference to track down these 6 assassins who are on the loose in the city.
Were you also able to, did you access the information for the heads of the British and Soviet security, like the same status as Mike Reilly, or was it more just general information?
Well, the British archives talk about their intelligence network, and they had been keeping track of the German intelligence assets in the city. They are the ones who, at one point, arrest, before the conference, the heads of the German organization in the city, and that actually works for the assassins' favor, because they have this safe house under surveillance, and the Germans realize that their head of the network in the city has been arrested, so they go to another safe house, and that's the one that the British can't find. So it sort of works against them. Again, everything seems to be working in the assassin's favor.
Mm-hmm. So, apart from filling in gaps in the historical record, what do you hope the book will do?
I hope on several levels. The book, on one level, is a previously unknown bit of history.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit of history on another level that should be resonating to us in the times in which we're living in, because we've seen how important leadership, or the lack of leadership, is in the time of crisis. We can see how life can change in an instant, just like that, in these times. And we can imagine, I think, with a greater and more chilling sense of immediacy, what was at stake on that night of the assassins in Tehran than ever before. And on a final level, I'd like to think it's a pretty good read for someone who wants to sit on a porch in the summer, read an exciting, suspenseful story that's also true, a real-life thriller. I think you can find it enjoyable just as that kind of engaging and entertaining book.
Did you have any difficulties getting the book finished or published?
Well, I've been, a writer for a while now. I started out the New York Times, nominated for 2 Pulitzers there. This is my 14th book and my 5th or 6th for HarperCollins. So I have a pretty good relationship with the editors and publishers there. So that wasn't the hard part. And writing it was fun. This was a fun story to tell. I've gotten involved with my characters, with Mike Reilly, with Schellenberg, with Skorzeny, and the idea of writing a fast-paced, suspenseful drama was a sort of a challenge that I enjoyed, and I look forward to every day returning to my desk.
Mm-hmm. So as an established writer, do you just come up with an idea and pitch it to publishers, or do you develop it, write maybe 10 or 20 pages, or what's your approach in figuring out what to do, to create a full-blown work?
Well, what I do is I read a lot, and then I find an idea. I say, yeah, this would be really fun to investigate. This is a story I'd like to tell. And I have to find the facts, and because my books they read like they are narratives. Narratives. I have characters that guide us through it. I have to then make sure that there are memoirs, letters, events that will allow me to say with accuracy what my characters are thinking and feeling. And once I find that, I then think about how I want to tell the story, how I want to structure it, and I'll put together 10 pages or so of how I see this book working. I'll take it to my agent and my editor at HarperCollins, and they'll say, "Yep, this sounds pretty good. Let's go ahead." And 2 or 3 years later, I'll have a book.
Have you had any projects? How long do you devote to doing this research? Pre-writing research before you just say, you know what, this isn't going to work out as a book.
Well, I've had many projects that I'll spend a month or two looking into it and realize it's not a book. But after 2 months, I'm either hooked or not hooked. I can see how this will develop, and I can see how after 3 years of research, I'll be able to tell a pretty engaging story. I'll be able to make the characters come alive on the page because I'll have actual access to what really happened and how they're really thinking and feeling.
I'm curious, what are there any projects you could mention that came close to becoming a book but just didn't quite make it?
Usually, if I put the 2 months of research into it, I'm then committed. At least for my next book, I was looking at a contemporary project, and I spent maybe a month looking around. Took a trip out to Kansas on something, and it just didn't feel right. I couldn't get enough of the documents. There weren't memoirs or letters, and the court case didn't have enough detail to make it rich enough for me to tell an actual true story.
So on that thread, do you have any future writing projects in mind, or right now you're just kind of fishing around?
I have an idea that I'm going to write, a book I'm going to write. It starts in 1978. A boat is floating on the Chesapeake Bay. There's no one on board. There's blood on the deck. There's top secret government documents scattered around the cabin. And there's a transmitter on the boat that's classified, and it's for communication with satellites. And from that real event, I think I tell a pretty good, or I look forward to telling a pretty good and engaging spy story.
Well, yeah, that's that little hook you just gave was, yeah, that got me.
Okay, well, I hope it'll get you in a couple of years when the book is done.
Have you written on military history before? Do you have previous articles or books?
Well, I have done a couple of books about World War II. I did a book called The Last Good Night, which was about an American debutante who becomes a spy during World War II. I did a book called Brigade, which is a group of Jewish soldiers from Palestine who go fight with the British Army in the last sort of months of the war and what happens to them after the war. I did another book about World War I called Dark Invasion, which is really about the first German attack on the homeland. It's a story about an anthrax attack on America in 1915. It's a story about how a bomb was placed in the U.S. Capitol building by German spies that goes off, and an attack on the richest man, assassination attempt on the richest man in the country, J.P. Morgan, who was severely wounded, and how the U.S. government turns to a New York City cop, Tom Tooney, to get a group of policemen to form the first sort of Homeland Security Corps to track down these German spies.
Interesting. Those must have been really interesting to research.
Yes, it's fun. What's so good about being a writer is you get paid to learn something, and that every couple of years I can learn something new. That's why I sort of pick eclectic topics so I can keep on learning different things.
Does Night of the Assassins do you have a bibliography in the back?
Yes, I do. I have a bibliography. I have a note on sources. I talk about where I got all the information. I just actually have an essay that's in Time magazine on how I researched the book. So I document very precisely the steps I took.
Okay. Where can people find you on the web? Do you have social media, web page?
I do. I have author Howard Blum on Facebook, at Howard Blum on Twitter. I have howardblum.com where I have a blog. I'm all over the place. I'm very 21st century for an old man.
And I'll just spell that for listeners. Howard, Howard, and Blum is Blum.
Right.
So that's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
I just enjoyed speaking with you, and I hope readers who are looking for a good book this summer that'll teach them some history, and at the same time engage them in a true life thriller might enjoy spending time with Night of the Assassins.
Good. Well, thank you for speaking with me.
My pleasure. Take care. Enjoy the weekend.
You too. Thank you for listening. If you like this podcast, Military History Inside Out, please subscribe to it and rate it and review it if possible. I have many other options as well to get great military history information. You can find links to interesting military history videos on my Facebook page, WarScholar. You can find links to interesting military history news articles, military history archaeology information, and academic information on my Twitter page, WarScholar. You can find photos on my Instagram page, Chris Alvarez WarScholar. You can find my military history videos on my YouTube page, WarScholar 1945. You can also sign up for my newsletter at warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. In the newsletter, I post additional video and news links, as well as regular updates on new military history books being published. Thank you for listening.